tuning into KZSMLP 104.1 FM. Welcome to COSMRadio, citizens of San Marcos. Real stories of locals and legends to bring you a little closer home. I'm your host, Lauren Hoffman. On this episode of COSMRadio, we'll get the inside scoop with award-winning filmmaker and photographer Ron Coley about his recently published book, Fountains of St. Mark, The Amazing San Marcos Springs. It's a book with large underwater pictures, topography, as well as information about aquatic life and historic and recent events regarding Spring Lake. We will also get to learn a little bit about his past experiences as well as other interesting, lesser-known facts and discoveries around the San Marcos headwaters. Definitely an interesting interview. Here's Ron Coley.
You know, I grew up in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. I graduated from Tulsa University with a degree in philosophy, and I wanted to be an underwater filmmaker. And so if there was ever a case of an individual having just almost what seemed like an impossible dream and being able to fulfill that, as I like to think that I'm a pretty good example of that scenario. That right after I graduated from college, that I was so desperate to make movies that I found myself taking any job that had anything to do with filmmaking, and that really, truly, I mean, you're walking around with this degree in philosophy, and that the next thing you know is you're getting hired to stack boxes and pull cables as part of a television commercial. And I did that for several years while making my own films that really, at this point in time, YouTube and all of these other venues did not exist. So that it was through a film festival in Chicago that I won my first award as a filmmaker. That as I traveled to Chicago, I became aware of the fact that there was an organization that had arranged for a big exposition of underwater explorers that included Jacques Cousteau and a number of names that were very significant to me. Might not mean very much to other people, your listeners, but that just this all weekend is just the most incredibly talented underwater explorers in the world. We're going to get together in the city that I had just by chance won an award for an experimental film. It's a 3.5-minute movie that so we're all there at that time in that place, and at the end of the weekend that this group had made money. They really were prepared to lose thousands of dollars. They had a big gala and a ball, and in a lot of ways what they did in Chicago in 1973 reminds me of what we're doing here in San Marcos with the Mermaid Society and this festival that's about to blossom here in September. So at the end of the week, they've made money, that they went to Jacques Cousteau and they said, "Captain, we have some money that we would like to donate towards your research." And he said, "How much is it?" And I said, "Well, it's almost $2,000. And he said, "You keep that money and you give it to a young person and you tell them to buy a plane ticket and come see me." And that is how the Our World Underwater Scholarship began. That's how my career as an underwater filmmaker went from being an impossible pipe dream to being something that really appeared to be a reality. And that I would spend from 73 until 1983 working on any kind of film project that I could work on that would either pay my rent, help me be a better filmmaker, or in some way was related to water. Now again, I'm in the middle of the United States. I'm not on the coast. I'm, going to coral reefs, loved it. Diving with whales, loved it. But that on a day in and day out basis, that I was really truly looking at fresh water as it was coming out of the ground, or it was coming out of an aquifer, or it was part of a freshwater lake. That in 1983 we had finished a PBS documentary that was called The River of Innocence. and that it was all of those things that I just described. It was in the center of the country, right here, in San Marcos. It was about water being stored in a giant aquifer, perhaps the most sustainable aquifer anywhere in the planet. That it was about rare and endangered species, and it was talking about thousands of years of people's history that was tied to this water supply. And that for me it was the perfect movie, and that the movie was very well received worldwide, and that here we are, what would that be, almost 40 years later, and people are still talking about the film. So I guess it was pretty good.
So for the listeners who may have not yet heard about the book, it's 12 by 15 inches, and I know that Janet Skaggs Harden did some of her artwork throughout that book. I'd like to acknowledge her, and also Diana Finley Hendricks, who has been a part of our community for a long time. And she helped out with the commentary. When I first saw it, I was instantly very drawn to it. Looking through it, it's like digging through a treasure trove of secrets that was in my backyard, and I had no idea. So I know a lot more about the headwaters in Spring Lake now because of it. Could you elaborate a little bit about the story and the purpose behind the book, and maybe go into a little bit of the organization and how you did the layout and why you decided on that layout?
So often when people start trying to equate value and significance, that there becomes this issue about size. That if somebody were to sit down and say, well, the Pacific Ocean's the largest thing on the planet, so it's got to be the most valuable thing on the big ice cap in Antarctica is the biggest mass of fresh water anywhere in the world, so it's got to be the most important. Studying Spring Lake and trying to make people realize just how concentrated the treasure of what's there, and how small that is relatively to the rest of the planet, to the rest of the state of Texas, to the rest of the San Marcos River. That, it's just a very small slice. And so my thoughts were very much about trying to really drill down and have this, if you will, microscopic view of what's going on in Spring Lake. I think that one of the reasons that I felt that strongly about doing it that way was because of the fact that it appears that there were people that felt exactly like that tens of thousands of years ago. The argument is going to continually come up about who were the first people here. What we're going to find is through each cycle of archaeology becoming more precise, of archaeology having a better set of tools to work with, is we're going to keep moving back. When did those first people arrive in North America? When did those first people arrive at Spring Lake? And of course, Spring Lake probably wasn't a lake then. General Burleson built a dam in 1849, and that I started to work in 1994. The history that we tell today is going to talk about Spring Lake being a man-made dam that was created in 1849 by the man who would establish the community of San Marcos. But as we dig down through the past, there is evidence that he was certainly not the first. And that some of the speculation right now is, well, this could have happened naturally. That before the Texas Revolution, there probably was a pretty large population of native beavers, that their nature is such to create a dam, the flow of the springs and the way that there would be a constriction and a bend that right now that we think of is where the restaurant on Spring Lake, I believe it's the Salt Lick that's there now. Before that it was a Joe's Crab Shack. Before that it was Pepper's, and before that it was an ice house. And before that it was General Burleson's Dam. You know, this is where he made this dam. Well, that kind of made a whole lot of sense. That was an easy place to dam these springs. And I think maybe at some point in time, beavers had the same idea when they made that dam. I think that when we look back at human occupation of the San Marcos headwaters, that you're going to find that during an ice age and during a tremendous drought, that the human tendency to want to capture and hoard water is something that's probably been expressing itself for tens of thousands of years. So I don't believe that General Burleson was the first person to build a dam. I don't think that humans were the only creatures on this planet to build a dam. And I think that the fact that this lake may be the oldest lake in Texas, with the possibility of it being the oldest lake in North America. You know, and when I say that, there's a little bit of a cheat factor there. Those huge lakes that's north of us would have been part of a large glacier. And when they dried up and there were ice, there's a real good chance that there was a 72-degree crystal clear lake that existed right here in San Marcos, Texas. And because of that, you know, I take a little bit of artistic license and say, well, you know, this is the oldest lake here. But that looking at the lake, dividing the lake up into sections, trying to make people realize that this end of the lake has a whole different cast of characters and a whole different personality. This was something that I felt pretty strongly that there was enough there to tell that story. That the list of creatures that exist throughout the entire lake is so long that maybe the best way to divide them up is in many of these creatures. You can find San Marcos fountain darters anywhere from the steps at the very beginning of Spring Lake right down to the confluence with the Blanco River. It's throughout the entire river. But there are other things, like the San Marcos salamander, that is only right here, you know, in Spring Lake. That's the only place that you'll find it anywhere in the world. And so what chapter do you put this animal in? That was a little bit of the challenge of how to do the book and do it in a way that would make it a compelling story for not just me to tell, but for people to view and read and reflect on how that a very small place can have so many facets to it that it makes an intriguing story.
To support stories of local history, heritage, and legends in the Central Texas area, please consider becoming a COSM sponsor, or you can make a donation. Visit COSMRadio.org, or if you're tuning into San Marcos, Texas Community Radio, KZSM-LP 104.1 FM, you can make a donation or become an underwriter of COSM Radio at KZSM.org. Help keep community radio alive.
There are times, and I have been very fortunate. I mean, when you spend as much time underwater and you spend as much time driving glass-bottom boats as I have done over the last 40 years, that I have seen blind salamanders pop up out of a spring. That when I very first came to San Marcos, that I wanted to go beneath the city of San Marcos and dive into those caves that allow us to go directly into the aquifer before they've come out of the springs. And that was the very first time I ever saw a blind salamander, was in a place called Ezel's Cave. That of all of the caves and of all of the fractures and all of the places to where you can gain access to the Edwards Aquifer, every one of those places that have had the listed federally endangered blind salamander has been underneath the city limits of San Marcos. Now, there's another blind salamander that they've discovered at Barton Springs, and that I believe that some of the people that I was fortunate enough to have a part of their training and being organized and becoming their own underwater explorers, that they've started to discover another salamander in Jacob's Well. But these are distinct, separate species from the one that's listed federally. Perhaps the most interesting thing about our blind salamander is that it has been on it was the very first creature ever put on the endangered species list. That is a little bit of a story, because that the endangered species list that was proposed in the 60s had no laws, it had no regulations, it had no real rhyme or reason about what it was that was going to be accomplished. But the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service sat down and said, you know, there ought to be a law that protects things that are so rare and we know so little about them that it would be a terrible mistake if we destroyed them before we got to know what they were or what they were about. And they go, well, you know, what would be on a list like that? And I said, well, things like the Texas blind salamander. And of course, the Texas blind salamander that they knew of was packaged in formaldehyde, had been captured out of the well that is now where the Freeman Aquatic Center is on the campus of Texas State University, and was being stored in a archival way at Scripps Institute of Oceanography in San Diego. You know, what's this all about? You know, why is this creature so specialized? Well, I've already alluded to the fact that I began as a documentary filmmaker, and that if you make documentary films about nature, about natural history, that there's a man named David Attenborough who has been doing this BBC series called Nature, and that when he described the Texas blind salamander, he said this is the most evolved creature on the planet. He said this is a creature that you know, this is, if you say, oh, I've got to have 72-degree water temperature, and that, you know, if you make it 75, it's too hot and I'm not going to reproduce. If you make it 65, that it's too cold and I'm probably going to die. That, you know, I've got to have this temperature. Then you sit down and you say, well, you know, what else? Well, I've got to have this water quality. You know, this has got to be, you know, you get any kind of dissolved solids, you add any kind of, you know, is really, really very picky about the water quality. I need perfect water. And that at this point I'm going to say that, having traveled all over the world doing stories about water coming out of the Edwards aquifers is as close to being perfect as anything that there is. So you got a salamander that needs perfect temperature, it needs perfect water, and then it needs to have an opening that's going to allow things that have grown on the surface, things that have participated in, you know, I mean, once you get inside the aquifer, there's no light, no photosynthesis. You know, what is a creature, what's a vegetarian going to do? You know, I mean, it's like, so it's got to have a connection from the surface to the water that is uninterrupted in a way that all of these fresh nutrients can get washed in after a rain event. And so that's where these animals are going to go, and that's where they're going to feed. And because that they're going to where the water can seep in and bring in these nutrients, they're going to be walking very close to places to where the upwellings and the springs flow out. And so then it's like being grabbed by a hurricane or a tornado and getting swept out to the surface. And it's just because that these creatures were getting swept out to the surface that we discovered them. And that once they were discovered, that they were recognized as being very unique, and that once they were described as being very unique, this idea of the federal government creating a list of rare creatures that were just too special to haphazardly let them disappear, that's where the endangered species list comes from. The San Marcos Springs are home to creatures that are the very foundation of the original endangered species list.
I had no idea it started.
And it kind of started right here almost 10 years before there was any kind of legislation that supported it.
Is there an area of Spring Lake that is particularly interesting to you, or a place that you like to visit often just because of its surroundings?
You know, I have just finished a book that divides this lake up into different zones. And that from the very beginning, when I first arrived here, that the lake was divided up into zones. That, you know, the idea that you could go dive in this part of the lake because you wouldn't be in the way of the glass-bottom boats, and, you know, that's where the archaeology project that I recorded in the 70s came from. That, you know, it was kind of like, these guys are right here and they're past where the glass-bottom boats go. But, you know, we were close enough to where if we found anything important, that the glass-bottom boats could just kind of jump right over there and we could show that stuff off. So those zones were something that was very much part of my relationship with the lake. But when it comes to your question, I think that the best answer that I can give you is that it isn't what part of the lake, but what time of day that you get into the lake. And the time of day is just sunrise and sunset there is just like being anywhere else in the hill country. You know, in the middle of the day, that it can be sort of drab and boring. That, you know, the sun could be just maybe a little bit too bright, you know, that there are things. But as you start getting into that sunrise or you get into that sunset, that you start seeing these incredible situations to where the natural light begins to give you things that painters from the Dark Ages, what was that period? Rembrandt and these people, when they were first starting to really capture the light. Seeing that light is more important to me than it is to what part of the lake. And so, you know, I really truly set out to make sure that each chapter of this book has a sunrise and has a sunset in it. And you know, that was one of my goals.
Taken back by your experience at night, that whole project that you did in the middle of the night. Could you go into detail a little bit about that, and maybe the American eel and the story with all of that?
It's interesting because the very first experiences that I had in Spring Lake was here because of a gentleman named Dr. Joel Shiner had approached the people that operated the Aquarena Springs Resort, and that it was a big, huge complex that was very thriving in the tourist industry, and that, you know, that it was kind of, we would be an inconvenience to them with our diving. And because of that, they said, well, you know, you go and you have this little archaeology spot that you're working on, and that you're not going to disturb us, and it's a good location for us. But if you want access to the rest of the lake, that you're going to have to wait until the glass-bottom boats stop running. Well, very few people realize this, but, you know, at the time that Aquarena was the highest, the most attended tourist attraction in Texas. And that the glass-bottom boats started running at daybreak, and they ran all the way into the evening, and there was, during that period of time, in anticipation of what was going to be the World's Fair in San Antonio, because of some bad events with Russia, it ended up being called Hemisphere. Half the world didn't come to the San Antonio World's Fair. They put lights in the bottom of Spring Lake so they could run glass-bottom boats up until 11 o'clock at night. I was diving for the archaeology project all day long and would have to wait till about midnight to be able to go and explore Spring Lake. So my very first pass to just go anywhere in the lake that you wanted to go was at night. And that I became to realize that there was a whole cast of characters you saw at night that you didn't see during the day. And the most unusual of those were the American eel, the North American eel, and also this giant river prawn. And unfortunately, when I made my book, I never ever got the chance to see or photograph the big giant river prawn. So this is still one of these elusive creatures. That's on my bucket list. But the American eel was something that we did come across, that we got shots that were, the first couple of times that we encountered the eels, that the pictures weren't all that good. They weren't that sharp. They didn't really reproduce the way that I wanted them to. So it took multiple tries. And that it was on an evening very close to, it's like, okay, if I don't finish this book this spring, I'm just going to go with the pictures that I've got. Because, there's thousands of pictures to pick from here. I've got enough pictures to do a book. But I'm going to try one more time to go and dive with the North American eel. And we decided we would dive on a night when there was going to be a full moon. Now, I didn't do this. I don't know that anybody did this, but I believe last night. When was the solstice? When was the
20th.
That is the first time that the summer solstice and the full moon have happened on the same night in quite some time. It was a pretty rare event. Mm-hmm. Those are the kinds of nights that going and seeing what's happening on the bottom of the lake have always fascinated me. And it was on a night like that we had our opportunity to we came into contact with 3 full-size North American eels. That we never ever got them all 3 to gang up for a group picture, although my dive partner that night, Jason Fisher, had a GoPro that he had stuck on a stick so that he could reach out and get things closer than maybe what the animals would let you approach. And I kept joking that it was a selfie stick, that he was going to take a selfie with all of these eels. These eels would have been somewhere between 3 and 4 feet in length, that they probably in age were they were the silver-sided last phase of the growth cycle of the North American eel, which amazingly goes through all of the stages. That a juvenile eel is a thing called an elver, and then elvers turn into these males, and then these males turn yellow and they turn into super males, and then the super males go all the way up to the river, to the beginning of the river, and they stay there for a decade. And then once they've gotten to that point, they go all the way back to the ocean. They migrate following the Gulf Stream to a patch of the Sargasso Sea that's off of Bermuda, and then they have babies and die. And so we were diving that particular night on that particular full moon with 3 female eels that were probably in their last several seasons here in Spring Lake. That they'd be going home to finish their journey pretty quickly, and we could tell that both by their size and their coloration.
If COSMRadio is helping to entertain your commute to work, please consider becoming a COSM sponsor, or you can make a donation. Visit COSMRadio.org. So on page 29 of your book, there's a map of Spring Lake and a little passage about the springs, and it kind of illustrates that picture. And it detailed something I never knew about, that there could be a spring behind the hotel or underneath it. Am I right about this?
There is a hand-drawn map that Burleson drew.
I saw that, yeah.
Okay, so now everybody knows about this. And when you start talking about springs, there's a number of different, what a wonderful place to live, because you can talk about a place called Dripping Springs. And then Dripping Springs is really a category of spring. And if you have a rock structure that will saturate full of water, and that water will drip down through that thing, and it'll create, and in some places these things create, it looks like showers. West Cave up in Austin is one of the most beautiful examples of what happens with a dripping spring over time. That you go into Natural Bridge Caverns or some of the other caves that are open to the public in Texas, and you'll see these wonderful stalactites that are tied to the ceiling, and that this is what a dripping spring looks like as it calcifies coming out of the ceiling. Another kind of spring that you have is what is called a seep, and that really truly is where the water is moving sideways through the water. Underneath the old hotel, there is a seep that has been going on for as long as that limestone has been filled with water. And it's not to be confused with the artesian springs that bubble up from the bottom. And so there's not like a huge spring that's being covered up underneath the hotel. It's the water is moving out of that hillside. Probably that water entered the ground somewhere around the Blanco River, out by where the Freeman Ranch is, or down that part of and it's been moving laterally through that limestone, and it comes to a place to where that it stops being in limestone and starts being in Spring Lake. And that's what's going on page 29. However, what's perhaps the rarest picture in the book is the picture of what looks underneath the diverting pipe in the center of the lake. And this right here is a glimpse of, there were 100 days in 2002 to where that we had taken this device that has got the net on the end of it, where most of the blind salamanders in captivity have been collected. And this device was placed on top of that spring in the drought of the 50s, when the water was to its, really truly, every other spring in Texas has stopped flowing except for the San Marcos Springs. And this is the place that the submarine theater is very strategically placed next to this spring, and they've taken this thing that looks like a giant funnel, stuck it on top of this spring, and they've focused that funnel so that it shoots water in front of the glass, where that even though that the rest of the lake's starting to get a little murky, that the rest of the lake's starting to not really have that dynamic flow that we almost take for granted, and that they fixed that problem by putting this contraption on top of this spring. Now, when I listen to the stories of the indigenous people talk about how that the ancient ones came out of the ground and they emerged from these springs, and then really truly it's not just one tribe or another tribe. There are many different Native Americans that have in their creation story this tale of their Garden of Eden is people coming up out of the ground, out of the water that flows out of the ground. Anybody that was living in the American Southwest had to be somewhere around where there's good water. So yes, all of these cultures, all of these tribes, all of these stories are going to find a spring someplace, because that spring was the source of life for them.
Right.
But the idea that there was a place to where people might really truly emerge out of the ground is that there's not very many of those in central Texas. And underneath this particular spring is one that I wonder if we haven't had it covered up since 1950, and that the rest of the world's forgotten about it. And so you were asking about zones and places that I particularly enjoy. And the one that I think that everybody wants me to say is Deep Hole. Mm-hmm. And Deep Hole is an exposed spring opening that if you were to get down on your hands and knees and look back into it with the water coming out of it, it's almost like trying to, it's like riding around in the back of a pickup truck or something like that with the wind, but that it's an opening that's a fairly large opening, that it's about the size of a fireplace, and that it goes far enough back to where your imagination wonders what's around that next little bend, that next little turn. And that I think that most people typically think, well, Deep Hole is where all of this water would have came out of the ground. This is where this would have bubbled up. This is what people would have been talking about when they were talking about the ancient ones emerging. But I kind of secretly think that they're talking about the one that we've got the diverter pipe put on top of.
Yeah. So, did Burleson ever keep a journal? Did he ever write any of the stories?
You know, that from the best that I can tell, there's a wonderful book about Burleson, and that Burleson appears to have been a functional illiterate. And when I say that, I think he was a quite eloquent speaker. I think that, you know, to have been the Vice President of the Republic of Texas, to have been the general that was in charge of the charge at San Jacinto, to have been, you know, this leader of men, he spoke very well. But I don't think he was comfortable writing things down. And so I've seen very little of what Burleson has written. I've seen things that people have written about Burleson, and that, you know, he's obviously was a very historic character, maybe much more so than modern Texas realizes. That on the day that General Burleson died, that they basically sat down and said, you know, this is the most important person in the history of Texas. And that whether or not that you're talking about the settlement of the West, you know, why in the world would we call this university right in the center of Texas, Southwest Texas? You ever?
I did wonder. Back when it was Southwest Texas, yeah.
It's because Burleson told Stephen F. Austin that he could defend the open territory of Texas, which at that point were way beyond what's Texas now, and included parts of New Mexico and Colorado. He said, we really truly can create a group of men, we're going to call them Rangers, and that we can go all the way as far as the Guadalupe River. We can go where the Guadalupe and the San Marcos River come together, which was not called the San Marcos River at that point in time, that you know, they really truly trying to decide exactly which river was which was still sort of a big issue. But this loop that you would think of would put the confluence of the San Marcos and the Guadalupe River as the most southern and most western place that Burleson thought that they could control Texas for between bandits and outlaws and Indians and all of these other things. So that was the southwest part. When they moved the capital to Austin, you know, Sam Houston and those people thought that was ridiculous. You know, you've really truly moved this so far to the west that we'll never be able to defend Austin. And of course, the only reason that Austin was the capital is because that Burleson, who had laid out the town of Waterloo, basically said, look, I don't want people to think this is politics. I will give Waterloo to the Republic of Texas to make the capital, and if this you know, republic is going to grow and get bigger, we can't stop at the Brazos River. And really, truly, that was kind of the plan at some point. There's a lot of people that would talk about whether you're talking about the Allen brothers that named their city after Sam Houston, or you're talking about Sam Houston. It's kind of like, guys, you know, if we get in trouble, we're going to have to rely on help from the United States. And if we get any further to the west than the Brazos, we probably, we're just out of luck. You know, we're too far, we're too remote. And Burleson didn't believe that. He thought that he could move that southwest corner of the Republic of Texas right here. And that's why we call it Southwest Texas State.
Did you ever find anything that left you scratching your head on these underwater dives, or?
I'm probably going to give you three answers to that question, because I believe the first one that you're going to talk about, there is a picture in the book of a freshwater jellyfish that is a very small, almost. When I took the picture, I could not tell whether or not that I'd actually taken a picture of what I was trying to capture until I blew it up. It was that small. That there are a number, when we talk about there being 8 listed or endangered creatures being in Spring Lake, I think the number of creatures that are in Spring Lake that are really unique, they're just really not found anywhere else in the world, probably that number's somewhere in the neighborhood of 24. And so there are things, but now you're starting to move into things that are very small. You know, there's some wonderful scientists that are here at Texas State University, that there's a parasite that was discovered by Dr. Huffman that's in this lake, that, you know, the only place that you find it is in these giant bass that grow to a very mature age in Spring Lake. And that, you know, so is this parasite ever going to get on the endangered species list? Probably not. You know, is this little red algae, which is a secret? 10 years from now, we'll come back and we'll talk. And if you find the red algae in my book, I will be very surprised. It's going to take somebody that has to look very closely. That there are 13 paintings in this book. And number 13 is going to be one that you're going to have to look real close to find. So there's a couple of little hidden gems in the book, and I think that's what you were asking about.
Yes.
The very first thing that I came across that made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever was that where Sink Creek bends around the peninsula and goes into the main run of the springs is at a place called Cypress Point. And right before it makes that bend, when you dive into that section, you will find several thousand golf balls. And at that point in time, the very first time that I came across that pile of golf balls, that made me scratch my head. And then once you realize what's going on with the golf course and the way that the water flows, well, of course, this is the pocket where they all collect. So that is something that really kind of threw me aback. And I think that one of the most rare and unusual things that I've ever found was right in front of the hotel. There was a toy car that was made at a time that our vision of what Buck Rogers or Superman or Commander Cody kind of thing was, we had these fantastic visions of what the future would hold. So this was a car that looked like what you'd expect to see of a typical station wagon or a typical sedan in the 1930s, with these super fins and things on it, to where if you'd all of a sudden made this car into a jet car. And of course there wasn't really anything aerodynamically, it wasn't a futuristic car. It was a very, so we found this little metal car right in front of the hotel, which obviously some child probably lost playing on that walkway right there. And then we went and we looked it up, and that, lo and behold, it was a very unusual, on eBay, this was, if this piece were to just be, if you had, and of course this one had been underwater for, the hotel opened in the late 20s, so this is probably a car that had been buried in the sediment underneath the hotel from 1930 until 2006. And so, that it had been down there a very long time. The droughts had come and all of this stuff, and that the floods and the rain and the pressure and the amount of water flowing out of the ground sort of revealed this thing. It went from one day you can't see it till the next day you can. And that is probably the best place to end this story about things that make you scratch your head, is the bottom of Spring Lake is so alive and so dynamic that it changes with every season, it changes with every drought, it changes every time. The bottom of Spring Lake immediately after the Halloween floods of last year was totally different than the Spring Lake that I began filming in 1976 when Dr. Shiner very first started doing his archaeology project. It moves, it changes, the way that it's all arranged is very vibrant and very alive, and that anybody that thinks that they have seen the San Marcos Springs doesn't really realize that, well, did you see it in the summer or did you see it in the winter? Did you see it during the drought or did you see it during the flood? Did you, I'm sure that I've taken at least 5,000 glass bottom boat rides, and no two glass bottom boat rides have ever been the same.
Since COSMRadio is all about Texas heritage and history, come check out one of our sponsors, Riley's Tavern, one of the oldest bars in Central Texas with the very first liquor license after Prohibition. It's located about 2 miles from the York Creek exit. There's live music, drink specials, a beer garden, pool tables, and more. Go to COSMRadio.org to find out how to become a sponsor for this podcast. So you were in charge of overseeing the transition from the theme park to the Ocarina Center for Environmental Education. Are there other plans to unplug something or to restore something? What's in the future?
My time at Ocarina, the change had to do with what's called programming. That didn't have to do with facilities, didn't have to do with the physical structure of the place. It had to do with, today you get off of a bus or you get out of your car and you walk in there and you see a clown and a mermaid and a pig, and it's like tomorrow when you get off the bus you're going to walk in there and you're going to see people sit down and try to explain to you the Edwards Aquifer and the endangered species and those kinds of things. So the change that I was responsible for and that I've had the great pleasure and great honor of working with all had to do with the presentation of what the visitor encountered while they were there. That in terms of the physical facilities, I was included in those plans and those discussions for a 10-year period of time. And I do know that they had hoped to do a great deal more than what's there now, and whether those plans are still being pursued or whether or not that those plans are being modified I'm not the best one to ask that question. We always wanted to get people back on the hillside. And if you go and you look at the rundown trails and the remains of what's on the hillside of that park, it's going to be a very big challenge, because to make it handicapped accessible, to do the kinds of construction without doing damage to the springs that are immediately below them, to do these things at a reasonable cost, and to do this in a manner that is not going to risk doing more damage than it does good, is going to be a difficult task. But I think that everybody wants to get access back to that hillside.
If you wanted to reach out to the newcomers into the area or to enlighten the longtime locals, what piece of wisdom could you give them?
When we began this interview and I discussed my past, I did allude to the fact that because of scholarships and film projects that I got to go all over the world, and that I'm quite proud of the fact that I have an adventure underneath all of the 7 seas, and that I use that number. I don't know if you've heard that expression, but he's traveled the 7 seas or he's seen the 7 seas. It's got a little bit of a tradition. You go look at the Statue of Liberty, and there are 7 little spires in her crown to mark the 7 seas. That all these people are coming from the 7 seas. And of all of the 7 seas that I have visited, that if I were only to get to pick one place to go back and visit again, I would pick the bottom of Spring Lake. I don't know that the locals appreciate just how rare, unique, and special this place is. And people are going to say, well, no, really, truly, you want to go back to the Red Sea, or you want to go back to the Indian Ocean, or you want to go back to the Cayman Islands. And it's like, well, I like all those places. I like all those places a lot. But no, this is the most special of all of those places. For the people that are moving in here, I would sit down and say that there is something that if the personality of this community is going to be defined by some particular element, is it going to be the outlet malls? Is it going to be the Amazon distribution center? Is it going to be this wonderful university? What's going to define this community? And I would say, as long as there is a river here, claim it. As long as there is a opportunity for these springs to flow and be this magnificent jewel of what an artesian spring is supposed to look like, protect it. And that's what is brought you here, whether you know it or not. I think that Austin's going through an incredible identity crisis right now. And that I believe that the explosive growth of people and the people coming from all over the country, are they there for what? I mean, they all want to have a bumper sticker that says "Keep Austin Weird," and they all want to, they all want to buy into this. This is the music capital of the world kind of thing. Everybody wants this. Well, when you look at what has happened to Barton Springs, when you look at the loss of identity that the community of Austin has gone through, that they're reinventing, the people that are moving in are coming up with a new concept of what made Austin Austin. And that could so easily happen to San Marcos. Unless everybody says, this is our river, these are our springs, and this is why we're here, and everything that we do needs to recognize that, to celebrate that, and to protect that.
Thanks for listening to COSMRadio. Be sure and check out Ron Coley's book, Fountains of St. Mark. You can find it at the Meadows Center at the San Marcos River headwaters or at roncoleybooks.com. Hey, stay tuned for our last episode of San Marcos History Month, featuring the director of the Center of Archaeological Studies at Texas State University, Todd Allman, and retired Texas State University geography professor, Dr. Jim Kimmel. Joining him is the creator of the Eyes of the San Marcos River Facebook page, Derek Lee. Check out his page to get involved in river cleanup and be informed of local river news. September is almost over, y'all, and you know what that means. Fall and Halloween are around the corner. Every month, COSMRadio conducts interviews around a theme. So for October and November, we will be doing stories of legends and the strange, stories told by locals and tales about the area. Hey, do you have a creepy story of your own? Write us at cosmradio@gmail.com, and we'd like to know all about it. If you're listening locally, please donate a few dollars to our San Marcos community radio station, KZSM 104.1 FM. Live streaming will also be available at kzsm.org. Keep community radio alive.